What happens when your engine fails mid-race? For NASCAR legend Greg Biffle, that question became a devastating reality, but not on the racetrack. On a cold January morning, the twin-engine jet he was aboard experienced what appears to be a catastrophic engine failure during one of the most vulnerable phases of flight shortly after takeoff. 3 lives were lost that day, and the investigation into what went wrong has revealed layers of complexity that go far beyond a simple mechanical failure. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into the Greg Biffle citation crash, examining what happens when an engine fails at the worst possible moment, and why the outcome of this accident may have been determined long before the aircraft ever left the ground. Before we get into the specifics of this accident, I need you to understand something fundamental about engine failures in aviation. Unlike race cars, where an engine failure means you coast to a stop or pull into the pits, in aviation, especially during critical phases of flight like takeoff and landing, an engine failure can quickly become a life or death situation. The key difference is margins. On a racetrack, you have runoff areas, safety barriers, pit crews ready to respond. In the air, especially at low altitude immediately after takeoff, you have seconds to make the right decisions and very little room for error. The Cessna Citation 2, the aircraft involved in this accident, is certificated as a twin-engine jet. That means it has 2 engines, and it's specifically designed to be able to fly on just one engine if the other fails. This is called single-engine capability, and it's a fundamental safety feature of all multi-engine aircraft. In fact, during pilot training and certification check rides, one of the most practiced emergency procedures is the engine failure on takeoff scenario. Pilots train for this repeatedly because it's one of the most dangerous situations they can encounter. But here's the critical thing most people don't understand. Just because an aircraft can fly on one engine doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean you have unlimited options. Single engine performance is significantly degraded compared to normal 2-engine performance. Your climb rate is reduced, your maximum altitude is reduced, your maneuverability is reduced, and perhaps most importantly, your available time to make decisions and execute procedures is dramatically reduced. Every second counts, and every decision matters. On the morning of the accident, November 257, Bravo Whiskey departed from Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina at approximately 10:05 Eastern Time. Weather conditions were marginal visual meteorological conditions. Cloud ceilings were around 1,200 feet, broken but overcast enough to be a factor. Visibility was approximately 5 statute miles, reduced by light drizzle. These are legal conditions for visual flight rules. Operations, but they're not comfortable conditions. They're not conditions that give you a lot of extra margin if something goes wrong. The Citation departed runway 10 and began what appeared to be a normal initial climb. But somewhere in those first few minutes, something went catastrophically wrong. We know from the subsequent impact site and the limited flight tracking data available that the aircraft attempted to return to the airport. It turned around, presumably trying to land on runway 28, the opposite direction from where it had departed, but it never made it. Approximately 10 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft impacted terrain approximately 1,800 feet short of the runway threshold. All 3 occupants, Dennis Dutton, Jack Dutton, and Greg Biffle, were killed on impact. Now let's talk about what we know from the physical evidence, because this is where the engine failure theory really starts to take shape. Post-crash photographs examined by multiple aviation analysts, including Juan Brown from the Blanco Lirio channel, show 2 critical pieces of evidence. First, the right-hand forward baggage compartment door appears to be missing from the wreckage. Second, there is visible and significant damage to the fan blades of the right-hand engine, the number 2 engine. That combination is not random, it's not coincidental. There is documented precedent for exactly this sequence of events. In 2024, just last year, a Cessna Citation 2 departing from Barranquilla Airport in Colombia experienced an opening of the right-hand nose baggage door shortly after takeoff. Items from the baggage compartment were sucked out by the airflow and pressure differential, and some of those items were ingested directly into the number 2 engine. The engine sustained massive damage. Fan blades were destroyed. The engine failed completely. In that case, the crew was fortunate. They had sufficient altitude, sufficient airspeed, and sufficient time to diagnose the problem, secure the failed engine, and return to the airport safely on the number 1 engine. Everyone survived, but that outcome depended entirely on having those critical margins of time and altitude. If the same scenario had occurred at lower altitude, with a less time to react, with less experienced pilots, the outcome could have been very different. And tragically, there's an even darker precedent. In 2007, another citation experienced a baggage door opening shortly after takeoff. But in this case, the crew became distracted by the chaos, the noise, the visual disruption of items flying around the cabin. They lost focus on the primary task of flying the aircraft. Airspeed decayed. The aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. There was insufficient altitude to recover. The aircraft crashed and everyone on board was killed. So, what makes these baggage doors so dangerous? Why is this even possible? Here's the disturbing answer. On legacy citation models like the Citation 2, the forward baggage compartment doors are not electronically monitored. There is no sensor. There is no warning light in the cockpit. There's no indication whatsoever to the pilots if the door is not properly latched. In modern aviation, where we have sensors and warning systems for virtually everything, this is a glaring and dangerous oversight in aircraft design. This is what aviation safety experts call poor human factors design. The system depends entirely on human perfection. There's no backup, no redundancy, no warning system. One person has to remember to check the door. One person has to properly secure the latches. One person has to verify it's closed. And if that one person makes a mistake, if they're distracted, if they forget, if they're in a hurry, there's nothing to catch that error. The first indication the pilots will have of a problem is when they're already airborne and the door blows open. Now, I want to be clear here. The NTSB has not yet officially confirmed whether the baggage door was the initiating event in this accident. They've stated that all four corners of the aircraft have been accounted for, meaning the major structural components, wings, fuselage, tail, have all been located at the crash site. This rules out in-flight structural breakup, which is important, but it doesn't tell us about smaller components like the baggage door. We don't know yet if it was found in the debris field, found somewhere else along the flight path, or is still missing entirely. However, the combination of a missing door in the photographs and visible engine damage creates a very compelling theory. If that door opened in flight, items were ingested into the engine, that would explain both the engine failure and the emergency return to the airport. It would explain why the pilots immediately turned around. It would explain the urgency of the situation, and it would explain why, despite having a second engine that should have allowed them to return safely, they didn't make it. Let's talk about what happens inside the cockpit when you experience an engine failure on a twin-engine jet. The first indication is usually a sudden yaw, a turning motion as the thrust from one engine is lost while the other continues to produce power. This creates an asymmetric thrust condition. The aircraft wants to turn toward the failed engine. Pilots are trained to immediately apply rudder pressure to counteract this yaw and keep the aircraft flying straight. Simultaneously, there are multiple warning systems that activate. Master warning lights illuminate. Aural warnings sound. Engine instruments show the failure. Loss of RPM, loss of fuel flow, loss of oil pressure, whatever the specific failure mode is. The pilot flying has to maintain control of the aircraft, maintain airspeed, maintain altitude if possible. The pilot not flying has to diagnose the problem, identify which engine has failed, and begin executing the emergency checklist. The emergency checklist for an engine failure is extensive. You have to secure the failed engine, which means closing the fuel valve, shutting down systems, potentially activating the fire suppression system if there's an indication of fire. You have to maximize performance from the remaining good engine. You have to recalculate your performance capabilities because now you're flying on reduced power. You have to determine if you can continue to your destination or if you need to return immediately. You have to declare an emergency with air traffic control if you're in contact with them. You have to brief an approach and landing on one engine. All of this takes time. It takes mental bandwidth. It takes training and experience. And it requires two competent pilots working together as a crew. The pilot flying focuses on flying the aircraft, maintaining control, maintaining the critical parameters of airspeed and altitude. The pilot not flying handles the systems, the checklists, the radio communications, the decision-making about where to land and how to configure the aircraft. And here's where we get to a critical question about this accident. Who was in those seats And were they capable of executing these complex procedures under extreme time pressure? We know there were three people on board. All three were certificated pilots, but only one, Dennis Dutton, held a citation type rating. Only Dennis was legally qualified to act as pilot in command of this aircraft. Dennis Dutton was 67 years old, a retired Delta Airlines captain with decades of professional flying experience. By all accounts, he was a highly competent, highly experienced professional pilot. Under normal circumstances, with a properly trained and qualified co-pilot, Dennis would have been entirely capable of handling an engine failure and returning to the airport safely. But we don't know who was sitting in that right seat, and that matters tremendously. The other two occupants were Dennis's son, Jack, a college junior in a professional flight program who held only a single-engine private pilot certificate with no multi-engine rating, and Greg Biffle, the NASCAR driver who did hold a multi-engine rating, but whose experience level in the citation is unknown. Under Part 91 regulations, the regulations governing private flight operations, a second-in-command doesn't need a type rating. They only need to meet certain familiarization requirements. But there's a huge difference between technically meeting regulatory minimums and being truly capable of helping during a real emergency. If Jack Dutton was in the right seat, despite not having a multi-engine rating, Dennis would have been essentially flying solo. Jack would not have been able to provide meaningful assistance with systems management, with checklist execution, with decision making. He simply didn't have the training or experience. Even if Biffle was in the right seat, if he wasn't thoroughly familiar with citation systems and procedures, his ability to help would have been limited. This is one of the fundamental problems with Part 91 operations compared to airline operations. In the airlines, both pilots are highly trained, highly experienced, regularly checked for proficiency, and required to complete recurrent training every 6 months. The captain and first officer operate as a genuine crew, with both fully capable of flying the aircraft and managing emergencies. In Part 91 operations, especially with loosely qualified second-in-command pilots, you may have one very experienced pilot and one person who is barely qualified to be there. In an emergency, that second person may provide no help whatsoever. There's a well-established statistic in aviation safety research. The pilot not flying is approximately 75% more likely to catch an error than the pilot who is flying, but that only works if the pilot not flying is properly trained, properly experienced, and knows what to look for. An underqualified co-pilot provides no safety benefit. In fact, they can be a distraction when the pilot in command most needs to focus. Now let's talk about the flight data, because this is where we can start to piece together what may have happened in those critical minutes. Flight Radar 24 shows very limited ADS-B tracking data for this flight. There are only 24 data points across the entire 10-minute flight. The first 23 points cover approximately 2.5 minutes. Then there's a 4-minute gap with no data, then one final point about 30 seconds before impact. From those limited data points, we can see that the aircraft climbed initially to approximately 2,000 feet. Then altitude began to decrease and airspeed began to decrease simultaneously. This indicates the pilot reduced thrust, likely intentionally. Even with an engine failure, if you're at full power on the remaining engine, you should be able to maintain altitude or even climb slowly. The fact that they were descending suggests they deliberately pulled the power back. Why would they do that? If the baggage door had opened, reducing airspeed would make perfect sense. High airspeed with an open door would cause more damage, would create more noise and disruption, would potentially cause more items to depart the baggage compartment and get ingested into the engine. By slowing down, they could minimize the damage and the chaos while they figured out what to do. The aircraft descended to approximately 1,500 feet based on the limited data, then appears to have stabilized briefly before beginning to climb and accelerate again. Over approximately 20 seconds, it climbed about 350 feet while accelerating about 19 knots. That's a climb rate of roughly 1,000 feet per minute. This is consistent with single-engine climb performance for a Citation 2. It suggests that at this point, they were attempting to gain altitude on one engine. But here's the crucial question. If they had one good engine and were able to climb, why didn't they make it back to the airport? The aircraft was only about 10 minutes into the flight when it crashed. The airport was relatively close. They should have had enough altitude and enough performance to make it back. So what went wrong in those final moments? Well, one possibility is that the workload was simply too high. managing an engine failure, dealing with an open baggage door, flying the aircraft manually in marginal weather conditions, navigating back to the airport without air traffic control assistance, all while at low altitude with very little margin for error. If Dennis was essentially flying alone because his co pilot wasn't experienced enough to help, that workload could have been overwhelming. Another possibility is a secondary failure or complication. Maybe the good engine developed a problem. Maybe there was more damage from ingested baggage items than initially apparent. Maybe control surfaces were damaged. Maybe the crew became spatially disoriented in the low clouds and drizzle. Maybe they misjudged their altitude or position relative to the airport. We simply don't know yet, and we won't know until the NTSB releases their findings. There's one more piece of evidence we need to discuss, and it's controversial. An audio recording surfaced online several days after the crash, purportedly containing radio transmissions from the accident flight. The origin of this audio is unknown. There's no verified chain of custody, but technical analysis suggests it's consistent with actual VHF aviation radio communications, not a fabrication. In this audio, a voice that sounds relatively young states there's an issue and mentions getting the landing gear down. The tone is clearly one of urgency and emergency, though the word Mayday is never used. What's notable is that the voice sounds young, not like a 67-year-old man. If authentic, this could suggest Jack Dutton was the one making radio calls, which would further support the theory that he was in the co-pilot seat despite not being qualified. The NTSB has been notably evasive about this audio in their press briefings. When asked about an emergency declaration, spokesperson Michael Graham initially said they had no knowledge of one, then later clarified that there was a text message from an occupant indicating an emergency landing. But he conspicuously avoided mentioning any audio. This evasiveness is unusual and suggests they're trying to avoid discussing who was in which seat until the official report is released. Here's what we know happened in the final moments. The aircraft was attempting to land on runway 28. It was on what appears to be a base leg, the second to last segment of the landing pattern, but it was low. The final ADS-B data point shows it was already below the altitude it should have been at for that position. 30 seconds later, it impacted the ground 1,800 feet short of the runway. 1,800 feet is not a huge distance. They were close. They almost made it. But in aviation, almost doesn't count. Either you make the runway or you don't. And in this case, they came up just short with fatal consequences. The question is why? Was it a misjudgment of altitude? Was it loss of power from the remaining engine? Was it an aerodynamic stall due to flying too slowly? Was it spatial disorientation in the poor visibility? We don't know. What we do know is that this accident represents a convergence of multiple factors, none of which alone would have been fatal, but together created a situation from which there was no recovery. Possibly an unsecured baggage door, poor human factors design with no warning system, possibly an engine failure due to a foreign object ingestion, marginal weather conditions that were legal but unforgiving, possibly an underqualified co-pilot who couldn't provide meaningful assistance, a pilot in command who, despite being highly experienced, was possibly overwhelmed by the workload and the time pressure. This is what we call the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. Every safety system has holes, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. Usually those holes don't line up. One layer of defense catches what another layer misses. But occasionally, rarely, all the holes align perfectly, and a hazard passes through every layer of defense. That's when accidents happen. If the baggage door had been properly secured, none of this would have happened. If there had been a warning system for the door, the crew would have been alerted before takeoff. If the weather had been better, the crew would have had more visual references and more margin for error. If there had been a fully qualified and experienced co-pilot, the workload could have been shared. If they had been in contact with air traffic control, they would have had vectors and altitude guidance. If they had been just a few hundred feet higher on the approach, they would have made the runway. But none of those ifs mattered. The reality is that all the vulnerabilities aligned, all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up, and 3 people died. This is the harsh reality of aviation. It doesn't forgive small mistakes when they accumulate. It doesn't give you credit for almost making it. It demands precision, preparation, and professionalism, especially when margins are thin. The NTSB investigation will continue for many months. The preliminary report expected in the next couple of weeks will provide some answers. It will tell us definitively who was in which seat. It will tell us what the cockpit voice recorder captured. It will tell us the condition of the engines when examined. It will tell us the status of the baggage door. It will provide flight path reconstruction based on all available data. But even then, we may not have all the answers. Some questions may remain unanswered until the final report is released, which could be a year or more from now. What we can learn right now, what we can take away from this tragedy without waiting for official reports is this. Regulations are minimums, not targets. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's safe. Just because you technically meet the requirements doesn't mean you're truly prepared. In racing, Greg Biffle understood this principle intimately. You don't just meet the minimum safety standards for your race car, you exceed them. You prepare for the worst case scenario, you train until your responses are automatic, you respect the dangers inherent in what you're doing. The same principles apply in aviation, perhaps even more so. When you're operating a complex aircraft like a Citation, when you're flying in marginal weather, when you're taking off with the knowledge that an engine failure could occur at the worst possible moment, you need more than minimum qualifications. You need genuine competence. You need thorough preparation. You need appropriate equipment and systems. You need adequate margins of safety built into every decision you make. The Citation II is a good aircraft. It has an excellent safety record overall. Thousands of them have been operated safely for decades, but it's not a forgiving aircraft. It requires proper training, proper procedures, proper crew coordination. When things go wrong, especially at low altitude, shortly after takeoff, there's very little time to figure things out. You need to already know what to do. You need to have trained for this exact scenario. You need to execute the procedures quickly and correctly. And you need a co-pilot who can genuinely help you, not someone who's just occupying a seat. In racing, when an engine fails mid-race, it's disappointing. It costs you points, costs you money, costs you a chance at victory, but you walk away. You'll race again next week. In aviation, when an engine fails at a critical moment, the stakes are infinitely higher. You get one chance to handle it correctly. There are no do-overs, no second chances, no next week. That's the fundamental difference, and it's why aviation demands such a high level of preparation and professionalism. Greg Biffle understood high-stakes competition. He understood risk management. He understood the importance of preparation and equipment. But aviation is a different arena with different rules and far less forgiving margins. This accident serves as a tragic reminder that when those margins disappear, when multiple small factors align in just the wrong way, even experienced people can find themselves in a situation from which there's no escape. The investigation continues. More information will emerge. We'll learn more about exactly what happened in that cockpit in those final minutes. But the fundamental lessons are already clear. Take human factors seriously. Don't depend on human perfection when engineered solutions are possible. Ensure you have adequate crew qualifications, not just regulatory minimums. Build margins into your operations. Respect the dangers inherent in aviation. And understand that when an engine fails at the worst possible moment, your survival may depend on decisions you made long before you ever started the engines. That's all for today. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and fly safe out there.